Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're pulling back the curtain on something that touches, well, pretty much every part of our lives.
Yeah,
Global trade.
that's right.
When we think about trade tensions, tariffs often dominate the headlines, those direct taxes on imports. But what if the real story, maybe the deeper game, is being played with quieter, more pervasive tools?
That's precisely what we're diving into today. We're moving beyond those, let's say, surface-level duties. We want to explore the intricate web of policies, practices, even geopolitical strategies that really shape who wins and loses in the global marketplace.
Okay.
We've compiled a fascinating stack of sources for you, showing how everything from, say, factory subsidies to the very stability of global currencies is interconnected. Our mission here is really to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights from all this complex material, helping you become truly well-informed.
Okay, let's unpack this. So if tariffs are the obvious, the kind of shouted barriers, today we're looking at these quieter tools, non-tariff barriers, NTBs. These are regulations, practices, policies, not tariffs, but they still restrict or distort trade.
Exactly. And China, being the world's largest trading nation, often faces accusations of using these hidden levers, you could say, to tilt the playing field.
Right.
So we're going to explore the whole spectrum of NTBs China is accused of using, look at what the data actually says, and also, crucially, what Beijing offers as its defense for each one. The real takeaway, I think, is how these seemingly technical rules can actually be quite powerful strategic tools.
Okay, where do we start?
Let's start with a big one. Industrial subsidies and their state-owned enterprises, or SOEs.
Ah, yes. Subsidies.
China is accused of pouring just vast sums into key industries. Think steel, solar, semiconductors, electric vehicles.
The strategic sectors?
Precisely. We're talking direct cash injections, preferential loans, even things like land use rights below market price. Some analysts estimate Chinese SOEs in just aluminum and steel got over $221 billion in subsidies in just a 4-year period. It's huge.
Wow.
And critics argue this isn't just, unfair competition. They see it as a strategic move. It allows Chinese firms to overproduce.
Dump products.
Dump products at below market prices, yeah. And that fundamentally reshapes entire global industries, often at the expense of jobs and businesses elsewhere. The key insight here, I think, is how these seemingly benign subsidies can act as this silent but really powerful weapon, transforming global markets from steel to solar panels.
That sounds like a pretty clear advantage for Chinese firms. But isn't some level of government support common globally? What makes China's approach so uniquely problematic beyond just the sheer scale?
That's exactly Beijing's argument. They argue subsidies are indeed commonplace, pointing to the US and EU subsidizing farmers or green tech, for example. They state that SOEs are crucial for China's own economic stability and employment.
Okay.
And that many subsidies are part of their strategic development plans, like Made in China 2025. They claim these are entirely WTO compliant.
But criticism persists.
Right. What makes it problematic for others often is the perceived lack of transparency and, as you said, the sheer volume. It can lead to massive overcapacity that then floods global markets.
Okay, so beyond direct money, another major challenge foreign firms report is pressure to hand over their innovations. This idea of forced technology transfer. How does that actually work?
It's a really persistent concern. For years, foreign companies operating in China have alleged that getting market access is sometimes conditional on transferring technology to local partners, especially in joint ventures.
Like a cost of entry.
Sort of. Reports indicate a significant percentage of American firms in China, particularly in high-tech sectors like EVs, aerospace, high-speed rail.
Right.
They've experienced this pressure. Now, China did pass a foreign investment law in 2020 that formally bans forced tech transfers.
Right.
And Beijing claims any past instances were commercial decisions between companies, not government-imposed. They also sometimes accuse the U.S. of weaponizing tech issues itself, pointing to actions against firms like Huawei as, well, hypocrisy. But the real friction point here is that perceived coercion, the feeling that market access isn't just about fair competition, but involves giving up valuable intellectual property.
It's definitely jarring that even with legal bans, it's still such a big concern.
Okay, so if companies do manage to get in, many of them report getting stuck in.
Yeah.
Well, Bureaucratic quicksand. Tell us about licensing delays and opaque regulatory approvals.
Exactly. It's another common complaint. Foreign firms claim they face longer, more opaque, sometimes seemingly arbitrary approval processes compared to domestic competitors.
In specific areas.
Yeah, especially in sectors like pharmaceuticals, financial services, cloud computing, even things like rare earth exports. Surveys from business chambers, like AmCham China, consistently show this as a major concern. Foreign companies might wait 18 months for approvals that Chinese firms apparently get in weeks.
That's a huge difference. It is. Now, China points to reforms they've made, like their negative list system for foreign investment, claiming most sectors are now open without JV requirements. They argue foreign firms are treated equally under Chinese law, and any delays are just due to high safety or data standards.
But the perception remains.
The perception and the experience reported by many companies is that the application of these regulations can be a significant non-tariff barrier. It creates uncertainty and cost. That's the critical takeaway.
And on the digital front, there's a lot of talk about data localization and cybersecurity laws creating sort of digital walls. What does that mean practically for foreign tech companies?
China has put in place some pretty stringent laws: the cybersecurity law, the data security law, the personal information protection law. Essentially, they mandate that a lot of data generated within China has to be stored locally, especially sensitive or personal data.
So you can't just use your global cloud infrastructure.
Not easily, no. It often requires building complex, sometimes costly local infrastructure for storage. Think of it, as some critics do, as China building its own digital Great Wall. It's a significant barrier for global tech companies.
And the risk.
Critics argue that operating through local Chinese partners, which is often required for cloud providers like AWS or Microsoft, can potentially dilute ownership and intellectual property protections.
And China's view.
Beijing frames this entirely differently. They call it digital sovereignty and a matter of national security, especially citing things like the Snowden revelations or U.S. cyber activities. They claim their rules aren't fundamentally different from, say, the EU's GDPR or U.S. laws on sensitive data, and argue that foreign digital dominance threatens China's national interests and citizen privacy.
It's a really complex balance, isn't it? National security versus open trade in the digital age. Okay, beyond data, what about actual physical products? We often hear about things needing special Chinese certifications. How do standards and certification barriers work?
You're right to point that out. It's another classic NTB accusation. China allegedly sets unique domestic standards for safety, tech specs, quality that are often incompatible with established international norms.
Meaning foreign companies have to
redesign products just for the Chinese market, or undergo costly, sometimes duplicative testing procedures within China. We've seen examples over the years from unique telecom standards back in the 3G era to the compulsory certification mark, the CCC mark, required for over 130 product categories now.
And things like food safety.
Yes, there have been complaints about arbitrary rejections in food safety tests, particularly on U.S. agricultural imports, for instance. China's response is generally that national standards are essential for consumer protection and for upgrading their own industries. The State Administration for Market Regulation, SAMR, states that a growing percentage, maybe around 39% of Chinese standards, now align with international ones.
So progress, but still friction.
Exactly. On food safety, they'd point to contamination incidents abroad and assert a zero-tolerance policy for health risks. The core challenge remains interoperability. Differing standards create hurdles that are expensive and time-consuming for foreign businesses.
And then there's the long-standing issue, intellectual property rights, IPR concerns. Has there been real improvement, or is IP theft still, well, rampant?
It's a mixed picture. China has definitely made efforts. They've established specialized IP courts, increased penalties for infringement. They point to the huge number of patent applications filed in China, over 4 million in 2023, as a sign of a maturing domestic innovation ecosystem.
And foreign companies winning cases.
Yes, reports suggest foreign plaintiffs actually won over 80% of their IP cases in Chinese courts in 2022. So Beijing argues the Western narrative of rampant theft is outdated and doesn't account for this progress.
But the complaints persist.
They do, especially in high-tech sectors. The U.S. Trade Representative's report still estimate U.S. businesses lose hundreds of billions annually to IP theft, with a lot attributed to Chinese entities, trade secrets, software piracy, counterfeiting. So the key insight, I think, is this persistent tension between China's genuine push for domestic innovation and the ongoing, very real challenges foreign firms face in protecting their inventions there.
Okay, moving on. Quotas and export restrictions. This seems particularly potent when it involves strategic materials like rare earths.
It absolutely is a powerful lever. China has used quotas and licensing systems to restrict exports of strategic materials. Rare earths are the most famous example. They control, what, 70–80% of global production?
And they've used it.
They've certainly been accused of weaponizing this leverage, yes. The incident with Japan back in 2010 is often cited. More recently, we've seen new export licensing requirements for materials like graphite and gallium, which are critical for things like batteries and semiconductors.
And beyond minerals.
We also see sudden bans on food products, Taiwanese pineapples, Australian wine, that are widely perceived as politically motivated, even if official reasons are different.
What are the official reasons?
China typically states these measures are about resource conservation, national security, or public health concerns. On rare earths, Beijing says it's cracking down on illegal mining and ensuring sustainable use. On the targeted food brands, they deny political motivation, usually citing things like pest infestations, labeling issues, or quality control problems.
But the impact is undeniable.
Oh, absolutely. The power of these restrictions lies in their ability to disrupt global supply chains quite suddenly and exert significant geopolitical pressure, especially when you're talking about materials essential to modern technology.
So we've covered subsidies, tech transfer, regulatory hurdles, data walls, IP issues, export controls. One more area. Investment restrictions, particularly this complex structure, the variable interest entity, or VIE. Foreigners often can't directly own majority stakes in sensitive Chinese sectors, right?
Right, that's correct. In many sectors deemed sensitive, think media, telecom, education, SLAM, foreign investors often can't hold majority stake, or sometimes any stake directly. To get around this and still access the market, they've frequently used these VIE structures.
Which are?
They're essentially legal loopholes. Complex contractual arrangements that allow foreign capital, usually through offshore entities, to control the operations and economic benefits of a Chinese company without actually owning it directly.
It sounds risky.
It carries significant legal risks, yes. And those risks became very apparent after China's regulatory crackdown in 2021, particularly on the edtech sector and on companies seeking tech IPOs abroad using VIEs.
What's China's justification for these ownership limits?
They usually point to concerns about national cultural security, ideological integrity, things like that. They have reduced the number of restricted sectors on their negative list over the years from 93 sectors in 2015 down to just 31 in 2023, apparently.
And their stance on VIEs now?
It seems to be one of cautious tolerance, but with a push for greater transparency and regulation. They haven't outright banned them, but the risks remain. The fundamental issue is that tension between foreign investors wanting access and China wanting to maintain domestic control over strategic sectors.
Okay, one last point on China's NTBs before we pivot. This idea of retaliatory bureaucracy or informal pressure, using regulatory tools for political ends.
Yes, this is perhaps the most difficult to pin down but frequently alleged. Countries claim China uses regulatory harassment or creates informal barriers against firms from nations that cross its political red lines.
Examples.
People point to things like sudden safety inspections, customs delays, or even encouraging consumer boycotts. The Lot case in China after South Korea deployed the THAAD missile system in 2016 is often mentioned. Or, more recently, the series of tariffs, bans, and port delays on Australian exports like beef, wine, barley, and coal after Australia called for an independent investigation into the origins of COVID-19 in 2020.
And China's response?
Beijing consistently denies any linkage between political disputes and trade actions. They usually blame public backlash, genuine safety concerns, or standard regulatory procedures. China often urges the non-politicization of trade, even as critics accuse it of doing exactly that. It's a very gray area, relying on subtle pressures rather than explicit barriers.
Okay, fascinating and complex. Now, you might think these kinds of trade distortions are mainly associated with countries like China, but let's pivot. Let's look at a major economy that, champions free markets, the United States, because this is where it gets really interesting. Many might be surprised to learn just how deeply the U.S. agricultural system relies on subsidies and corporate structures.
It really does. It's quite a paradox.
Yeah.
Because behind that iconic image we all have of the rugged, independent American farmer lies a very complex web of government support and increasing corporate consolidation.
How big are we talking, subsidy-wise?
The scale is immense. U.S. agriculture received over $53 billion in government support in 2022 alone, according to OECD data. And projections from the Congressional Budget Office suggest over $460 billion will be spent on farm programs between 2023 and 2033, mostly through the massive Farm Bill.
Wow. And who gets that money? Is it the small family farms?
Well, that's the striking part. Data from groups like the Environmental Working Group shows that the top 10% of farms, usually the largest ones, receive over 75% of the subsidies. A huge portion, over $430 billion between 1995 and 2021, went to large-scale producers of just a few commodity crops.
Yeah.
Corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, and rice.
The big five.
Exactly. So the key insight here is that these subsidies aren't primarily propping up the small family farm ideal. They're largely flowing to big farms, to large corporate-scale agricultural operations.
Well, it's not the quaint image we often hold on to, and this
Yeah.
connects to what you call the rise of corporate agriculture.
Precisely. It's a massive structural shift. Think about this. Agricultural employment in the U.S. has plummeted. It was 41% of the workforce back in 1900. Today, less than 1.3%. It's incredible.
And just 4% of farms now account for 2/3 of all agricultural production value. These are often corporate farms operating thousands, even tens of thousands of acres, leveraging huge scale and capital.
And this leads to market concentration.
Absolutely. Extreme vertical integration and market power. Major agribusiness corporations dominate entire supply chains. You have companies controlling seeds and chemicals like Bayer and Corteva. Meat processing is dominated by Tyson, JBS, Cargill, grain trading by ADM, Bunge.
The giants.
The giants. Just 4 firms control over 80% of beef processing in the U.S. and 67% of pork processing. It's effectively an oligopoly.
And what about the remaining family farmers?
Many of them now operate under contract farming arrangements with these corporate giants. The corporation often owns the animals, dictates the feed, the care protocols. The farmer essentially provides the labor and the facilities, often taking on significant debt but with very low margins and little control. It's a very different reality from the independent farmer image. So the whole landscape has shifted from independent producers to this highly consolidated, corporate-driven system.
Fundamentally transformed, yes.
And what actually gets subsidized in this system? You mentioned the big 5 crops. It sounds like it's not necessarily the food that nutritionists tell us to eat more of.
You're absolutely right. The lion's share of these subsidies goes to corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, and rice. And what are these crops primarily used for? Feeding processed food supply chains, producing biofuels like ethanol, and feeding livestock.
Not exactly farm-to-table fresh produce.
Not typically, no. Meanwhile, fruit and vegetable growers, what the industry calls specialty crops, and farmers practicing organic or regenerative agriculture receive minimal direct support through these main subsidy programs.
So critics have a point when they say,
quite starkly, junk food is subsidized, healthy food is not, the implication is pretty clear. These agricultural subsidies inadvertently shape our entire food supply and influence consumer choices, heavily favoring industrial agriculture over more diverse, potentially healthier options.
So, with all this money pouring into agriculture and this corporate structure, how does the U.S. justify a system that seems, on the surface at least, contradictory to its free market principles?
Yeah.
And what are the global consequences?
The justifications are varied. First, there's the national security argument. Framing farming as essential to food security, ensuring a reliable domestic food supply, especially in crises.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, supporting rural livelihoods. Subsidies are defended as a lifeline for struggling rural economies that need to support the American farmer, even if it's mainly the largest farms benefiting most.
Right.
Third, increasingly, there are climate and conservation goals tied in. Programs like the Conservation Reserve Program pay farmers to leave land fallow, and newer farm bills include incentives for things like carbon capture and soil conservation.
So environmental angles too.
Yes, although the effectiveness is debated. And finally, there's trade leverage. Subsidies act as a tool of trade diplomacy. Export promotion programs help U.S. agribusinesses compete, sometimes dominate, foreign markets.
But this must have a huge global fallout, right? Especially for farmers in developing nations.
It does, profoundly. U.S. subsidies tend to depress global prices for key commodities. Take cotton, for example. Countries in West Africa, Mali, Benin, Burkina Faso lose millions, maybe billions, annually because heavily subsidized U.S. cotton floods the market and lowers prices.
Making it impossible for their farmers to compete.
Exactly. Similarly, subsidized U.S. grains can undercut farmers in Latin America and Asia. This contributes to rural poverty, pushes people towards cities, increases income volatility, and, ironically, can increase dependence on foreign food aid. As the critics bluntly put it, free trade! This isn't even fair trade.
Has this led to formal disputes?
Oh, yes. It's been a major source of friction at the World Trade Organization, the WTO. The Brazil-U.S. cotton case, which ran from 2002 to 2010, was a landmark dispute. Brazil successfully argued and proved that U.S. cotton subsidies were violating international trade rules and harming their producers. U.S. subsidies remain a frequent complaint in WTO agriculture negotiations, especially from countries like India, China, and the African group nations.
So the global consequence is quite severe. A system meant to support American farmers can inadvertently devastate farming sectors in other, often much poorer, nations.
That's the stark reality of it.
And this must lead to accusations of hypocrisy, doesn't it? When the U.S. criticizes other countries for market distortions.
Absolutely. Critics are very quick to point to the massive scale of U.S. farm support and also politically targeted bailouts. Remember the Trump administration's farm aid package. $28 billion between 2018 and 2020, primarily for farmers hurt by the trade war with China.
I do remember that.
That package was more than twice the size of the auto industry bailout back during the 2008 financial crisis.
Wow, that puts it in perspective.
It does. So the central insight here is that powerful nations, even those championing free markets rhetorically, often engage in practices that seem to contradict those very principles when it comes to protecting their own strategic domestic sectors, like agriculture.
Okay, from these specific examples, NTBs in China, subsidies in the U.S., let's zoom out even further. Let's talk about the very foundation of international commerce, the U.S. dollar. There's a lot of conversation these days. You hear the term de-dollarization. What's happening here? What does this mean for the financial backbone of the world?
This is a critical question because it seems the world is undergoing a slow but significant structural shift, moving perhaps towards what some call monetary multipolarity.
And what's driving that?
A key factor is concern about the U.S. fiscal situation. The U.S. faces what some analysts call an emerging fiscal crisis, potentially threatening the stability of the whole post-Bretton Woods international monetary system.
We're talking about the national debt.
Primarily, yes. The U.S. federal debt is currently over $36 trillion. Highly influential figures like J.P. Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon have used strong language, warning about an impending crack in the bond market that could trigger a catastrophic realignment.
And we're seeing signs in the markets.
We're seeing surging yields on long-term U.S. government debt, which reflects investors' growing concerns about long-term fiscal health. And significantly, major rating agencies S&P back in 2011, Fitch in 2023, and Moody's just recently changed its outlook to negative, have downgraded or warned about U.S. debt. This puts U.S. sovereign risk perceptions closer to countries like Italy or Greece than historically has been the case.
And what's particularly troubling, you argue, is the seeming political inability in the U.S. to actually correct course.
Precisely. Perhaps the most worrying aspect is the apparent deadlock in the U.S. political system. Enacting serious fiscal consolidation, which would likely require significant tax increases and reforms to major entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare, seems politically radioactive.
And those programs face deadlines, don't they?
They do. Projections show Social Security's main trust fund could be depleted around 2033, and Medicare's hospital insurance fund around 2036, potentially forcing benefit cuts if no action is taken.
So this domestic uncertainty fuels the global shift.
It definitely contributes. This political stalemate, combined with other factors, has accelerated efforts by various countries and blocs, think BRICS, the EU, ASEAN nations, to reduce their dependence on the U.S. dollar.
What other factors?
Well, besides the U.S. budget deficits, there's the increasing use of financial sanctions by the U.S., sometimes called dollar weaponization, which makes other countries nervous about relying too heavily on the dollar system. Add in general political unpredictability and a perceived erosion of global trust, and you see the momentum building.
And what do these efforts look like?
We're seeing initiatives like direct currency settlement mechanisms between countries trading in yuan and rupees or rupees and rubles, bypassing the dollar. There's talk of regional alternatives like a potential West African eco-currency.
So it's not necessarily about one single rival currency like the yuan or the euro replacing the dollar overnight.
That's the fascinating part, I think. It seems less likely we'll see a single challenger dethrone the dollar completely. Instead, the world appears to be moving into a more multipolar currency landscape, meaning the dollar will likely remain very important, perhaps still first among equals for a while, but it will increasingly coexist with other major currencies and systems. Competition is clearly rising from alternatives like holding more gold reserves, the increasing international use of the Chinese yuan, regional payment systems, maybe even enhanced roles for things like the IMF's special drawing rights, SDRs, or perhaps even a common BRICS currency someday.
So the dollar's dominance, while still huge, is facing unprecedented challenges from a diverse set of alternatives.
That seems to be the direction of travel, yes.
And this brings us to a really crucial, if somewhat complex, economic concept, the Triffin Dilemma. How does that fit into the dollar's global role and the current challenges?
The Triffin Dilemma is a fundamental paradox, really, at the heart of the dollar's position as the world's main reserve currency.
Okay, break it down for us.
Imagine you're the bank for the whole world. Everyone needs your currency to trade, to invest, to save. So you have to supply lots of your currency to the rest of the world.
How do you do that?
The main way the U.S. does this is by buying more goods and services from the rest of the world than it sells by running persistent trade deficits. This sends dollars flowing out.
Okay, so that satisfies global demand for dollars. What's the dilemma?
The dilemma is that the very process of supplying all those dollars, running those deficits year after year, also leads to a massive buildup of U.S. debt held abroad. Over time, this can weaken confidence in the long-term value and stability of the dollar itself.
So the thing you have to do to maintain the dollar's global role eventually undermines that role.
That's the paradox, exactly. Exporting dollars through deficits satisfies global liquidity needs today, but potentially erodes trust in the dollar's stability tomorrow. It also creates domestic issues, like potentially weakening U.S. industries and growing the national debt.
Which connects back to the fiscal concerns we just discussed.
Precisely. It's all interconnected.
So given this dilemma and the shifting landscape, some argue the U.S. should actually take the lead in rethinking the global system, like a new Bretton Woods moment.
Yes, there's a strategic argument that it's actually in the U.S.'s own long-term interest to help convene a kind of Bretton Woods 2.0. The idea would be to proactively shape the transition to a more stable multipolar system, rather than just reacting to changes.
What would that involve?
It could involve finding ways to decouple the provision of global reserve assets from U.S. trade deficits, perhaps through shared international institutions, or giving a much bigger role to neutral assets like the IMF's SDRs. It could also be an opportunity to embed updated values into trade rules, thinking more about fairness, sustainability, inclusivity.
And reforming existing institutions.
Definitely. Reforming the original Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and World Bank, to give emerging economies a fairer say, more voting power, to enhance their legitimacy and effectiveness in this new multipolar world. It's about managing geopolitical change through cooperation.
That sounds incredibly ambitious, maybe even idealistic, given the current global climate. What are the real-world risks and challenges?
They are huge. History shows us that reforming global monetary and trade architecture is incredibly difficult. It requires enormous trust and a sense of shared strategic purpose among major powers.
Which seems lacking today.
To put it mildly, today's geopolitical fragmentation, the intense rivalry between the U.S. and China, the war in Ukraine, all of this makes deep coordination extremely challenging. Plus, some global actors might not want to reform the existing system. They might prefer to build entirely new institutions outside of Western influence.
So the political will might just not be there.
It requires immense political will and a level of international cooperation that is, frankly, in very short supply right now. The real question is whether global powers can somehow set aside their immediate rivalries to address these fundamental long-term fragilities in the system before a crisis forces their hand.
A sobering thought. Okay, let's try to connect these really big ideas, NTBs, subsidies, the shifting dollar system, to a very specific, potential real-world scenario involving trade tensions.
Okay.
We've seen how China might use NTBs, how the U.S. uses subsidies. What about a rising power like India? You've outlined a fascinating scenario where India could potentially use a kind of rare earth-style strategic squeeze, not literally with minerals, but by leveraging sectors where it has unique control or influence.
That's right. The hypothetical context we explored is one where, say, the U.S. imposes significant tariffs on India, maybe 25% or higher, perhaps, hitting products important to a U.S. president's political base, especially in an election year.
Okay.
The question then becomes, what kind of leverage does India possess that the U.S. couldn't easily replace or ignore, particularly under that kind of political pressure?
And India does have leverage points.
It has several potentially powerful ones. First, and perhaps most critically, pharmaceuticals. We could call this the generic drug button.
Why is that so potent?
Because India is a pharmaceutical powerhouse, especially in generics. It supplies roughly 40% of all U.S. generic drug imports by volume and around 20% of all U.S. FDA-approved generics, branded or not.
40%. That's huge.
It's massive. Any significant disruption to that supply, even just delays or uncertainty, would very quickly cause shortages and price spikes for American consumers for common medicines. That's an absolute nightmare scenario for any administration, especially in an election year.
So, essential goods, even seemingly mundane ones like generic drugs, can become incredibly powerful strategic assets.
Absolutely. It's a key insight.
Okay, beyond pharma, what other sectors give India this kind of potential leverage?
Well, think about IT services and back office operations. India is in many ways the backbone of IT support for corporate America. They handle everything from software development and maintenance to call centers, data processing, even complex financial services for many Fortune 500 firms.
So a slowdown there would hurt U.S. businesses.
A significant slowdown in outsourcing or even just disrupting the flow of skilled IT workers through visas like the H-1B could cause major operational headaches and costs for U.S. corporations.
What else?
Space and defense partnerships. This is increasingly important. U.S. defense contractors Lockheed Martin, Boeing, GE Aerospace rely on India for billions of dollars in existing and potential contracts, plus joint production lines for components. Any move by India to slow walk deals or signal favoring European or Russian suppliers could hit U.S. jobs in politically sensitive districts, the so-called swing states.
Interesting. And you mentioned agriculture earlier. Even though the U.S. heavily subsidizes its own, could India use agricultural access as leverage, too?
It absolutely could, yes, because India represents a huge potential market for U.S. farm exports, things like soybeans, almonds, apples, lentils, pulses. Even just imposing retaliatory tariffs or creating import hurdles for a few symbolic products that are important to specific U.S. farm states could generate negative headlines and pressure from politically influential agricultural lobbies.
So targeting specific political constituencies.
Exactly. And then there's the broader geopolitical context. India is widely seen as a crucial geopolitical swing player.
In the U.S.-China dynamic.
Primarily, yes. India's strategic alignment, its stance, can really tip the balance in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. needs India as a key partner in initiatives like the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue with Japan and Australia. If India were perceived to be tilting away from the U.S., perhaps towards closer ties with Russia or even China on trade or energy matters, it would immediately undercut U.S. strategic goals in the region.
And lastly, skilled labor.
Yes, migration and skilled labor flows. Indians consistently dominate the U.S. H-1B visa program for high-skilled workers. They form a critical pipeline for talent in the U.S. tech industry and are a growing source of PhDs in STEM fields from U.S. universities. Any move by India to subtly discourage or restrict this flow could directly impact U.S. tech competitiveness in the longer term.
So it's clear India potentially have a multi-pronged leverage strategy, touching economics, domestic politics in the U.S., and high-level geopolitics.
That's the picture, yes. A range of tools.
So let's walk through how India might actually use this leverage in what you called a smart squeeze strategy, a kind of step-by-step escalation map designed to achieve its aims without triggering outright conflict.
Exactly. It's a hypothetical game theory map. Let's imagine stage one, the signaling phase. India wouldn't do anything drastic initially. Maybe it would publicly announce a review of export regulations for certain critical generic drugs, citing domestic supply security concerns. Simultaneously, maybe it announces new tax incentives encouraging Indian IT firms to diversify operations outside the U.S., and perhaps invites European or Japanese defense firms to tender for projects previously discussed, mainly with U.S. companies.
Subtle signals. How would the U.S. likely react?
The U.S. might initially dismiss it as posturing, maybe some diplomatic grumbling, but you can bet corporate lobby groups, pharma, IT, defense would start making concern calls to Washington. Murmurs would begin.
Okay, so if the murmurs aren't enough, what's stage two?
Stage two, the light pressure phase. Now, India applies a bit more direct pressure, but still plausibly deniable. It could strategically delay or even deny a few export licenses for select generic drugs heading to U.S. buyers, officially framing it as ensuring pandemic preparedness reserves or quality control. At the same time, maybe it imposes, say, 30% retaliatory tariffs on specific U.S. agricultural products, almonds, apples, pulses, things that are very visible in key farm state media outlets.
targeting those constituencies again.
Precisely. And perhaps announces a postponement of upcoming joint military exercises with the Quad partners, citing scheduling conflicts.
What's the likely impact of this stage?
Now, you'd likely see real pressure building. U.S. pharma distributors would be scrambling, agribusiness lobbyists would be demanding action from the White House and Congress. The media would definitely start running stories about the India problem.
That would certainly get attention.
Yeah.
But what if the U.S. administration digs in its heels? How does India escalate further?
That brings us to stage 3, the escalation phase. Here, India takes more significant, tangible actions. It could publicly announce prioritizing pharmaceutical exports to other regions, the EU, Africa, ASEAN, while assuring the U.S. market it will still receive shipments, just maybe at reduced volumes or with longer lead times.
Creating more uncertainty and cost for U.S. buyers.
Exactly. Simultaneously, maybe India passes a new data localization law requiring U.S. cloud providers currently operating there to invest heavily in building new, separate data infrastructure within India, adding significant cost and complexity.
Hitting the tech sector.
Yes. And maybe it follows through by awarding a major defense contract for fighter jets or submarines to a European or Russian bidder rather than the American one.
Ouch. The political fallout from that.
Significant political blowback, especially from congressional representatives in districts linked to that lost defense contract. Business lobbies across pharma, tech, and defense would be screaming for the administration to roll back the initial tariffs that triggered this.
Okay, this is serious pressure. But what's the ultimate threat? The stage where India really plays its strongest cards.
Stage 4 we could call the strategic threat phase. This is where India signals the potential fundamental shift in alignment, hitting major U.S. strategic interests. For instance, India might announce exploratory talks with Russia and China on cooperation in areas like rare minerals processing or advanced semiconductor fabrication areas where the U.S. is actively trying to counter Sino-Russian influence.
That's a direct geopolitical challenge.
A huge one. And maybe India then threatens a full, though temporary, suspension of all pharmaceutical exports to the U.S., say, if the punitive tariffs persist beyond 90 days. And perhaps leaks hints through diplomatic channels that it might have to reassess its level of military cooperation within the Quad framework if bilateral relations continue to sour.
Wow. That forces a major choice on the U.S. president.
Absolutely. At this point, the U.S. administration faces a stark choice. Either find a way to de-escalate quickly or risk fundamentally damaging the relationship and potentially losing India to a rival strategic bloc. It changes the whole geopolitical calculation.
So assuming the goal is de-escalation, there needs to be a way out, an off-ramp.
Yes. Stage 5 has to be the off-ramp or resolution phase. India would signal its willingness to return to normalcy. It offers to immediately resume normal pharmaceutical export flows, confirms its openness to considering U.S. bids for future defense contracts, and publicly reaffirms its commitment to Quad cooperation.
In exchange for?
In exchange, the U.S. administration would agree to roll back the specific tariffs that initiated the dispute and perhaps commits to fast-tracking negotiations on a limited free trade agreement or resolving other bilateral trade irritants. Both sides get a way to claim victory and step back from the brink.
Looking at this whole hypothetical strategy, what are the key principles India would be using?
Several key strategic principles seem to be at play. First, targeting politically sensitive constituencies within the U.S. pharmaceutical consumers facing price hikes, farmers in swing states losing export markets, defense workers facing job losses, corporate donors worried about IT disruptions. Maximize domestic political pain for the U.S. leader. Second, controlling the tempo of escalation. Start small, use signals, apply pressure incrementally, allowing the U.S. opportunities to back down at each stage before reaching the most damaging threats. Third, using plausible deniability wherever possible. Frame actions around domestic needs like health security, quality control, or regulatory updates rather than explicit retaliation. And finally, aiming to keep other allies close. By framing its actions carefully and avoiding overly aggressive moves initially, India would likely try to avoid diplomatic isolation and maintain support from other countries also concerned about U.S. trade actions.
It really is a potential masterclass in leveraging strategic dependencies without resorting to outright confrontation.
It demonstrates how non-military leverage can be incredibly powerful in today's interconnected world.
So as you can see, listening to all this, the world of trade is just so much more complex than the tariffs and the headlines we usually focus on.
Absolutely.
We've peeled back the layers today on those hidden non-tariff barriers, explored the real paradox of agricultural subsidies in a supposed free market champion like the U.S.
Delved into those fundamental shifts impacting the U.S. dollar's global role.
and even mapped out the kind of strategic chess moves countries like India might employ in future trade disputes.
It really just highlights how deeply interconnected our global economy is now. Actions taken in one corner of the world, whether it's a subsidy in Iowa, a regulation in Beijing, or a policy decision in New Delhi, can have surprising, significant ripple effects everywhere else, shaping everything from the cost of your prescription drugs to the balance of geopolitical alliances.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this? I think it means understanding that the global economy isn't simple. It's a complex dance, full of surprising moves, subtle pressures, and hidden dynamics. We really encourage you to keep exploring these issues, keep questioning the headlines, and keep digging deeper into the forces that are shaping our shared world. And maybe as we close out this deep dive, the ultimate provocative thought isn't just about market efficiency or who wins and loses in trade deals. Perhaps it's about something deeper: fairness and power. Is the ongoing debate about global trade truly just about economics? Or is it fundamentally about national interests, geopolitical power, and maybe even the unfinished business of, well, decolonizing trade? What kind of global economic system do we truly want to build for the future? And who should lead that change? Something to think about.